312 people were sipping champagne beneath chandeliers that cost more than most homes. The air was velvet and gold, filled with polished speeches and carefully controlled smiles. But the moment Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said the colonel's name, just one name, Melania, Trump's crystal glass slipped from her hand and shattered on cold marble. The room gasped. A waiter froze mid-step, and for exactly 4.7 seconds no one spoke. Because in that instant, every person in that ballroom realized this wasn't about gossip. This was about power and the silence used to protect it. What if the First Lady of the United States wasn't just hiding a secret, but had built her entire public life around keeping it buried? And what if the one woman brave enough to say it out loud didn't raise her voice, but simply asked the one question no one dared to face? What if silence isn't innocence but strategy? This is a dramatized story, inspired by real tensions, real emotions, and the all-too-familiar machinery of power. This narrative blends imagination with truth to ask what happens when someone finally pulls back the curtain. The characters are fictionalized. The feelings they evoke are not. There was something sacred about the way the ballroom breathed that night. The New York Liberty Gala, held once a year inside the century-old Belvedere Hall, had always been an evening of controlled elegance, where senators clinked glasses with CEOs and the press for one night kept their notebooks closed. Gold chandeliers dripped light like honey, casting a warm glow over navy tuxedos, satin gowns and whispered conversations stitched with power. Velvet curtains framed 20-foot-tall windows. A classical string quartet nestled in one corner, bowing out Vivaldi's Winter, with such precision it felt almost mechanical. Waiters glided between polished tables like shadows, silver trays balanced effortlessly, champagne fizzing like quiet secrets. At precisely 8:21 p.m., the music paused. Not abruptly. It faded almost like it sensed something shifting. That was when Melania Trump appeared. No one had seen her name on the guest list. There had been no Secret Service suite beforehand, and yet there she was, walking past the white marble columns in a floor-length silver gown, subtle shimmer catching the light with every step. Her posture was regal, rehearsed, but her eyes, they flickered, just once, and only for those who were looking. A few heads turned. One woman from the governor's table whispered, "Is that?" before trailing off. Melania didn't smile. She simply nodded to the nearest organizer, who looked just as surprised to see her. She made her way slowly toward the center of the room, past a sea of gazes she had grown used to, yet never entirely trusted. She didn't belong there that night. And maybe she knew it. Then the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone turned toward the stage as the host cleared his throat and stepped up to the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, a brief deviation from the program," he said with a polite smile. "Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has requested a few words." There was no applause, just a quiet shift in temperature. AOC emerged like a contradiction, simple black suit, no jewelry, no stylistic embellishment, and not a trace of nervousness. No teleprompter, no cue cards, just her in a small manila folder clutched loosely in her left hand. She reached the podium and waited. Waited until every fork was lowered, every conversation halted, until even the waiters stopped mid-pour. And then she said it. This isn't about scandal. This is about the truth. And it begins with the First Lady. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical, the kind that cuts. All eyes turned, slowly, like synchronized gears in a machine suddenly grinding to a halt, toward Melania, standing now near the dessert table, untouched glass of champagne in one hand, and her free hand gently brushing the side of her gown. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch, but she blinked, just once. The quartet didn't resume. The servers didn't move. The host stood, frozen lips parted but without a sound. It was as if the room itself had stopped breathing. What truth, what beginning, and why now? Guests looked around for clues, for scripts, for someone else to take the mic. But AOC held the moment quiet, unwavering. Her eyes scanned the room not with defiance, but with expectation, like she already knew that everything after tonight would change. And somewhere in that stillness, amidst all the wealth, the perfume, the polished shoes, and expensive lies, someone's phone buzzed. Then another, and another. One notification read, "Did you hear what she just said? and suddenly the ballroom felt like a courtroom. Melania stepped backward just a little, not out of fear, but like someone bracing for impact. And across the room, AOC raised the folder. Not high, not dramatically, just enough for the cameras to catch it. Then she said almost softly, "I don't need to raise my voice. The evidence will speak." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood still for a moment longer, as if weighing the weight of the silence she was about to break. Her fingers brushed over the thin manila folder, resting on the podium, not in hesitation, but in ritual. The ballroom remained breathless. It was no longer a room of donors, diplomats, or dignitaries. In that second, it was a stage built by power and now held hostage by one woman's question. She opened the folder slowly, no theatrics, no rush, just deliberate movement. A single sheet of paper faced her. A whisper passed through the crowd like a wind trying to find an exit. Then came the name, Colonel James Renner. It landed like a dropped glass on marble, sharp, clean, shattering something invisible. Gasps were audible. One man near the orchestra muttered, "No way," under his breath. Phones came up like reflexes. Screens lit. Thumbs moved. The room shifted, not physically, but psychologically, because they all recognized that name even if they hadn't said it out loud in years. Renner hadn't appeared in headlines since a quiet, unexplained reassignment 2 years earlier. No scandal, no press conference. He'd simply vanished from public view like smoke sucked out of a room. And now his name echoed from a congressional voice in a ballroom built on secrets. AOC didn't look at Melania. Not yet. She looked straight ahead, voice steady, calm, but sharp enough to slice velvet. "You didn't just meet him," she paused. "You moved him. You silenced him." A few people shifted in their chairs, the kind of restless discomfort that comes when a script is abandoned and no one knows what scene comes next. Even the host, still lingering at the edge of the stage, looked down at his shoes. AOC turned her gaze now finally toward Melania. Not accusingly, not cruelly, just directly, like someone who had waited long enough for truth to stop hiding behind protocol. He was assigned to Central Intelligence Coordination in the spring of 2022. 4 weeks later, without notice, he was transferred to a logistics unit at Fort Sumter. 3 weeks after that, he vanished from the public registry. No press release, no reason. But do you know what happened in between? Mrs. Trump Melania didn't answer. But her body changed. Slightly. The hand that had once rested gracefully on the base of her champagne flute now clutched her wrist instead, just below the bracelet. Her shoulder line stiffened. Her chin tilted upward, not in pride, but in an unconscious act of preservation. AOC didn't wait for a reply. "You met with him 5 times in private residences, off schedule, off record. And not once did the logs reflect those visits. You didn't just make a mistake. You erased a pattern." Cable news, which had previously cut away to other segments, snapped back to the live feed. Across America, living rooms grew quiet. In diners and VFW halls, older viewers leaned in. The First Lady, one of the most photographed women in modern political history, was now center stage for something no stylist could fix. AOC tapped the folder once. A soft but definitive sound. She didn't wave it, didn't open it further. She just let the weight of her words fill the room. This isn't tabloid gossip. This is a question of access, of accountability, of how far silence can go before it becomes a security risk. Melania blinked. Once, twice, she didn't speak. But in that moment, no words were needed. Her silence said everything, and the country was listening. By the time Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped off the stage, the gala had fractured into something unrecognizable. No more chamber music, no polite murmurs of wealth. Only static gasps, twitching fingers, and the invisible screech of tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface of American politics. She didn't stay for photographs, didn't wait for a standing ovation or backlash. She simply descended the narrow stairs and vanished into the service corridor behind the velvet curtain, her silhouette the last thing many remembered before the phones took over. 10 minutes later, your Renner Gate was trending in 13 countries. In Nebraska, a retired colonel at a VA center whispered James Renner, but he was, and then fell silent, eyes wide. In a Manhattan newsroom, a junior producer dropped her coffee as the system flooded with notifications from users uploading decades-old summit footage. And in Florida, inside a high-security compound with soundproof walls and biometric locks, the First Lady's senior advisor turned to a young aide and muttered, "Full lockdown. Now." Across X, formerly known as Twitter, the digital storm rolled in without mercy. Someone unearthed a clip from the Madrid Economic Forum 3 years earlier, just 17 seconds long. Poorly lit but unmistakable Melania, stepping out of a black diplomatic vehicle, turning slightly and smiling at a man in military dress. A tall man, square jaw, colonel's insignia visible even in low resolution. She had placed her hand on his arm as they entered the venue. Innocent, perhaps, but now context twisted it like wire. On TikTok, a grainy shot from a Serbian airport re-emerged Melania, boarding a private plane alone, yet behind her a blurred figure in uniform moved swiftly, shielding his face from cameras. The video had been ignored in 2022. In 2025, it hit 1 million views in under 90 minutes. Cable news anchors adjusted mid-sentence. MSNBC cut back to the gala feed. Fox News went into overdrive, one commentator half shouting, "This is not just about gossip, this could be a breach of protocol at the highest level." CNN pulled up an old Senate oversight file mentioning Renner's sudden transfer. NPR ran a segment titled "The Disappearance of a Colonel." No one had answers, but everyone had questions, and Melania She said nothing. No tweets, no statement, no photos leaving the venue. Her security detail rerouted her exit, diverting to an underground tunnel connected to a nearby hotel. No press followed. Inside, her team's cell phones were taken, devices scrubbed. Her chief of staff issued one sentence to the press pool: "The First Lady will not be commenting at this time, but silence in moments like this behaves like gasoline." Conspiracy theorists awakened like they'd been waiting for years. Podcasters recorded emergency episodes. Body language analysts uploaded side-by-side comparisons of Melania's expressions with timestamps and arrows. One clip, just 5 seconds, showed her blink twice at the podium. Someone captioned it, "Guilt speaks when words do not." Meanwhile, Alexandria disappeared. No post, no follow-up, no press conference. She had said her truth, and like a match lit in a dry field, she let the world do the burning. And burn it did. By morning, the White House press office had fielded over 200 formal media inquiries. The Joint Chiefs issued a rare no comment on military personnel transfers. And somewhere in a small town in South Carolina, James Renner's childhood home had a single black SUV parked outside with tinted windows, engine still running. For millions watching the chaos unfold, one thing was clear: this was no longer a rumor. It was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. Behind the curtains of history, few noticed the stillness. Not the stillness of peace, but of absence. The kind that echoes. Inside the East Wing, where everything was silk sculpture and schedule. Melania lived in a palace of quiet that muffled even her own breath. The White House gleamed for the world, but to her it often felt like a mausoleum, polished, preserved, and cold. At official dinners, the president spoke long, firm sentences about deals and doctrine. Melania nodded, smiled, wore gowns that shimmered under chandelier light, but her eyes always drifted. Not in rebellion, in resignation. She remembered a winter night during the second year of his term. Snow fell gently across the south lawn. The window in her private parlor fogged with condensation from the tea she had forgotten to drink. Her heels were off. Her phone was silent. A classical concerto played low in the background, the kind that pretended to soothe while burying unrest deeper. She opened a book not to read, but to feel less invisible. No one knocked. No one called. Even the staff had learned that silence was what she preferred, or at least what she required. It wasn't always like that, but somewhere along the climb to power, she had been traded for an image. The real woman replaced by photographs, her words narrowed to safe scripts. In interviews, they asked her about shoes. In cabinet meetings, she wasn't invited. On anniversaries, he sometimes forgot which year it was. Her presence was aesthetic, her personhood optional. And then there was Renner. Colonel James Renner didn't say much. That was the first thing she noticed. He stood in shadows while others spoke loudly, shook hands too hard, grinned too wide. He never lingered in her presence, but never fled it either. The first time they spoke, it wasn't even with words. It was a glance across a hallway in Brussels. She had just stepped out of a NATO luncheon. He was standing near a doorway scanning the corridor, his posture impossibly still. Their eyes met briefly. She expected the usual hurried nod or practiced smile, but Renner simply acknowledged her calm and unthreatened. No presumption, no agenda. She found herself looking for him at the next summit. She didn't know what she was looking for, just that when he was nearby, she felt seen, not watched, not judged, just seen. In one meeting overseas where foreign ministers argued about oil corridors and missile shields, she found herself stepping into a garden to breathe. Renner was stationed nearby. He didn't follow. But when she paused by a fountain and glanced over her shoulder, he was there, not watching, but aware, like someone who could sense a storm before it reached the glass. They never had a conversation that would raise alarms. Nothing intimate, no notes passed, no hotel rooms. But over months, something deeper grew, an understanding. In every nod, in every silent acknowledgement, he offered something no one else in Washington had ever given her: respect without performance, attention without expectation, space without abandonment. Back in her residence, in the soft gold glow of antique lamps, she would sometimes pour a glass of red wine and sit alone on the edge of the couch. She'd remember the way he had just once opened a door for her and said, "Careful, ma'am, it's icy." The way he'd said "ma'am" had no trace of sarcasm, only sincerity. It clung to her more than the silk on her shoulders. She never dared to name what she felt. But in that world of titles, handlers' secrets, and sterile power, Renner had been the only thing that ever felt real. And now he was gone, erased, denied, like he had never mattered. But he had. To her he had. And that truth, once buried, was now rising. Alexandria remembered the smell of bleach on her mother's uniform more than she remembered bedtime stories. Blanca worked as a housekeeper in Westchester, 2 trains and a bus from their cramped apartment in the Bronx. Most days, AOC waited at the window until night draped itself over the fire escapes, and the sound of keys in the door told her it was safe to exhale. Her mother would enter, exhausted sometimes, crying behind a tight smile, her hands red from chemicals, her back bowed from scrubbing the lives of women who had no idea what her name was. That was Alexandria's first lesson in American architecture, not of buildings but of distance. Distance between floors, between zip codes, between women like her mother, and women like Melania. Even as a child, she knew there were rooms she wasn't meant to enter, stores where eyes followed her too closely, classrooms where no one pronounced her last name correctly the first time, subways where she learned to wrap her keys in her fist. The Bronx didn't build fragility. It built awareness, survival, fire. She carried that fire into her 20s, waiting tables, balancing college papers, with double shifts, watching politicians on the overhead TVs speak of tax cuts for people who thought tipping 20% was charity. Then came the campaign. No endorsements, no big donors, no roadmap. Just a pair of worn sneakers, a voice too bold for its age, and one line she carried in her chest like gospel: "I will never fear the room they say I don't belong in." She remembered the first time she walked into a congressional hearing. The wood smelled like money. The glances smelled like judgment. But she sat down anyway. She spoke. She stayed. And they learned one by one that she wasn't decoration. She was declaration. To Alexandria, Melania had always been a mirror reflecting everything the system protected. Not because she was cruel, but because she didn't have to be anything at all. Melania floated above the noise, insulated by wealth image handlers. She was never asked to earn the podium. Never questioned for her silence. She existed as permission for power to stay beautiful, to stay untouched, to stay quiet. Alexandria didn't hate her. Hate was too easy. She studied her, from televised speeches where the First Lady barely moved her face to appearances at hospitals and galas where her voice seemed borrowed. AOC knew that look, like someone living in a world not their own, but too tangled in silk and silence to escape. It wasn't that Melania was evil. It was that the world around her was engineered to let her exist without consequence. Until now. Until Renner. The folder AOC had held at the Liberty Gala wasn't thick, but its weight was immense. Not in pages, in implications. Melania had touched something she was never supposed to. Not a man, not a romance, but a rule. A rule that said women in her position must remain silent, still ornamental. By stepping out of place even gently, even unknowingly, Melania had opened a door, and Alexandria was ready to walk through it. This wasn't vengeance, it was exposure. Because Alexandria wasn't after one woman. She was after the machine. The one that taught her mother to clean quietly. The one that let the First Lady move through life as if the rest of them didn't exist. So when she spoke that night under golden chandeliers, AOC didn't do it to humiliate Melania. She did it because silence had cost too much for too many. She did it for women who had never worn couture, never had a publicist, never had a second chance. She did it because the truth deserved a voice louder than a scandal. And now, the world was listening. The office was nearly empty except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant thrum of New York traffic below. Alexandria sat alone near the window, the city sprawling beneath her, like a patient holding its breath. Her fingers drummed against a ceramic mug long gone cold, but her thoughts were burning. She had spoken at rallies, marched in protests, stared down billionaires and pundits who tried to make her name a punchline. But there were moments still when she had been silent, moments that haunted her between interviews and hearings. The high school teacher who casually joked about illegals. The donor event where a tech executive laughed about using overseas labor to keep costs cute. The woman on the campaign trail who had whispered about her assault, eyes pleading for justice. AOC hadn't known how to give. And then, she'd said nothing. She thought she'd forgiven herself for those silences. But tonight in this dim room above a restless city, they returned like ghosts, asking for a second chance. A knock broke the stillness. Sophia, her chief of staff, entered quietly. No makeup, no clipboard, just a file in hand, her face pale and tight. She walked straight to Alexandria's desk, placed the folder down like it carried something radioactive, and whispered, "We weren't supposed to see this." Alexandria opened it slowly. Photos, briefs, communications logs. Most of it redacted, but the outline was enough. A classified detail about Colonel James Renner's final overseas posting. The contradiction in his travel records. The sudden disappearance. And tucked at the back, a security feed still image. Blurry but unmistakable Melania. Renner, a corridor, a hand on an arm, a look exchanged. Sophia's voice cracked the silence again. Now we can't unsee it. Alexandria closed the folder and looked up. Her team hadn't asked questions yet, but she could feel them waiting outside the room behind glowing laptop screens at the other end of late-night phone calls. They were waiting for her to speak first, to decide if this was politics or principle, and she knew this wasn't strategy. This was soul. She stood slowly, walked to the whiteboard where they'd once mapped out policy battles with colored markers. But tonight there were no diagrams. Only a question scrawled in her own handwriting from weeks ago after a particularly bruising debate. What are we afraid to say? Her eyes narrowed. We say it now, she said, turning to Sophia, while the country's watching. Sophia didn't respond with logistics or doubts, just a nod, a breath. And then she turned and walked out the door to wake the team. Alexandria stayed behind for one last moment with the city. The streets were still alive with people who would never know this decision was made tonight in silence over a folder not meant to be opened. But they would feel its echo in headlines, in living rooms, in the uncomfortable questions they'd soon be asking. She wasn't aiming at Melania. She was aiming at a truth the system had tried too hard to bury. And this time she wouldn't be quiet. It began with a single ping, no subject line, no sender name. Just an encrypted email that bypassed every filter and landed directly in Alexandria's private inbox. The timestamp read 3:14 a.m., and for some reason it didn't feel like spam. She clicked. One sentence. Ask why Colonel Renner vanished after Mexico City. She read it once, then twice. Her pulse ticked faster. She tapped Sophia awake at 3:17. By 3:22, their team was on a secure server cross-referencing movement logs from the Department of Defense embassy records and private contractor manifests. It was supposed to be a routine overseas summit, the kind where American officials shook hands, gave speeches, and boarded flights home. Renner had flown in, but he never officially flew out. Buried in a folder of security reports, they found something odd, a last-minute cancellation of his debriefing in D.C., logged as delayed for medical. Yet there were no follow-up health records, no digital trace, no orders. His name stopped appearing altogether, as if someone had backspaced him out of the system. Then came the real break. A junior analyst named Malik Barely out of Georgetown had been tasked with scraping diplomatic visitor logs from the Summit Hotel for inconsistencies. He messaged Sophia with a line of text that froze everyone. There were 3 unlisted guests in Suite 1810 between midnight and 4 a.m., all registered under Renner's name. 2 male, 1 female. The female used a pseudonym, but attached was a screen cap of facial recognition software doing what humans could not. The match was over 92% certain. Melania Trump. The photos were grainy, pulled from a dim hallway camera. Her hair was pulled back, her face obscured by a cashmere wrap. But the profile that gate it was her, and the dates matched. 3 nights, unscheduled, off record, in the middle of a summit with no stated purpose for the First Lady's presence. Alexandria didn't speak for a long time. What would a First Lady be doing in a locked suite with a military officer at that hour during a summit she was never officially supposed to attend? And why, after that visit, did he vanish? The story was too brittle to present yet, too many holes, but the leak had cracked the narrative open like a fissure beneath marble. Sophia whispered, "It's like someone wants us to see it, but only if we're willing to look harder." That's when the second email arrived, same encryption. No text, just an attachment, an audio file. Alexandria's hand hovered over the play button. She looked at Sophia. Neither blinked. The clip began with static, then the low rustle of a hallway, a hotel door creaking, and then 2 voices, muffled. Male and female. Hard to distinguish exact words, but one sentence landed clear. A woman's voice. "You don't walk away from this, not now." And then, silence. A long one, followed by the slow sound of retreating footsteps. The email file auto-deleted 3 seconds after playback ended. By dawn, Rennergate had already reached trending status again, but now the whispers were darker, more surgical. People weren't just asking about what AOC said. They were wondering where Renner was, why the military hadn't issued a statement, why no obituary ever appeared. And one question started gaining traction on the message boards and in private group chats. What did Melania know, and why had no one asked her before the air was thick with the kind of anticipation that precedes a storm? Not weather, history, and someone somewhere was still feeding the thunder. The timeline didn't just whisper, it screamed. AOC's team, now operating more like an intelligence unit than a congressional office, had begun overlaying Melania Trump's known travel history with Colonel James Renner's duty assignments. Initially, the matches felt coincidental, public visits, national tours, holiday appearances. But as the patterns stacked, coincidence began to feel calculated. March 4, 2019, Melania delivers a Be Best speech in San Antonio. That same day, Renner is logged at Fort Sam Houston, less than 30 minutes away. August 15th, a visit to a children's hospital in Arizona. Renner was stationed at Fort Huachuca during a high-level readiness inspection. November the 2nd, a quiet detour from the White House schedule. Melania's team listed her as off-grid. Renner's leave records list him as non-active location withheld. That same weekend, no photos, no press. Then came the crack in the porcelain. A former base photographer, long retired, posted an old image on a niche veterans forum. The caption was simple: Fort El Paso Spring 2020. One of the strangest days I've ever shot. At first glance, it was an ordinary shot, military drills blurred in the background, warm desert sun bleeding across the frame. But in the lower right-hand corner, just out of focus, were 2 figures. A woman in ivory slacks and a blue scarf. A man in full uniform, no hat, his hand not at salute, but resting lightly on the woman's back. Someone zoomed. Someone enhanced. It was her. Melania Trump and Colonel James Renner. No press detail, no known event, and no visible security, which broke standard operating procedure for any appearance of the First Lady. The internet took the image and dissected it like scripture. Body language experts began appearing on morning news panels. One former Secret Service officer said coldly, "That's not protocol, that's personal." Another chimed in, "There should have been a visible perimeter," and there wasn't. That's a breach or an intentional absence. The photo was picked up by newsrooms within hours. CNN aired it beside a flashing banner, "Unseen Moment Melania and Renner at Fort." Fox blurred the image slightly but still ran the segment. MSNBC brought in a military historian to discuss the chain of consequence when First Ladies go rogue. By noon, hashtags splintered into factions. Jockers Renner Gate, CUI, where is Renner? Yashir Fort El Paso cover-up. AOC hadn't spoken since the gala, but her silence only poured gasoline on the fire. Without issuing a single new word, she had flipped the nation's media ecosystem into a frenzy. Inside the White House, damage control surged into overdrive. One aide leaked that 3 crisis meetings were held within 12 hours. Another claimed Melania's team was scrambling to verify a race or explain the Fort El Paso appearance. But every explanation fell short. There was no official record of her visit there, no manifest, no mission. No one recalled seeing Air Force transport arrive that day, because if she hadn't come through the front gate, how had she arrived? The narrative was unraveling. And for the first time since AOC had uttered Renner's name, Melania Trump herself was no longer a symbol, she was a subject, scrutinized not as a distant, untouchable First Lady, but as a woman potentially entangled in something too intimate and too dangerous for official records. The country wasn't just watching anymore, it was investigating. By 7:04 a.m., the image from Fort El Paso had already become a banner across CNN's morning segment. There were no caveats, no cautious phrasing, just bold white letters. "Unexplained encounter First Lady and Missing Colonel B-roll" ran quietly in the background. Desert wind rustling the American flag. The blurred photo again enhanced now with a glowing red circle around the two figures. CNN's anchor, usually measured, couldn't hide the edge in her voice. If this was nothing, why is there no record? Why is no one talking? By 8:30 a.m., MSNBC joined in panels of experts debating everything from power dynamics in high offices to the ethics of silence. But across the cable aisle, Fox News struck a very different tone. Their Chiron read, "Smear campaign AOC's political stunt targets." "First Lady," the host scoffed on air. "This is what happens when you put radicals in office. Baseless accusations, doctored photos, coordinated chaos." He didn't mention Renner by name. Neither did anyone on the panel. Instead, they focused on AOC, her ego, her thirst for the spotlight, her need to destroy what she can't become. The divide was growing. Online, the nation cracked in two. One side flooded Twitter with threads of dates, maps, photo comparisons. TikToks with voiceover analysts, Reddit threads connecting every unverified sighting of Colonel Renner since 2021. People scrolled for hours, drawn into the gravity of a mystery that felt stranger than fiction, but somehow more honest than politics had in years. The other side clung tightly to the idea of fabrication, that AOC had orchestrated the entire thing, photoshopped, staged, weaponized public emotion. Conspiracy hashtags emerged. Deep state set up. Renner never existed. But beneath the noise, something more chilling settled in. The White House issued a brief robotic statement. "The First Lady has no comment on circulating rumors, which are both false and harmful." Not a denial, not an explanation. Just distance. Melania herself had vanished again. No sightings, no updated schedule. Her official social media went dark. The silence only fueled the frenzy. News networks began doing retrospectives on Renner's military career, interviewing former colleagues. A single quote from one of them aired across 5 networks. "He wasn't the kind of man you forget." But suddenly everyone's pretending they did. And still AOC said nothing. Since the gala, she hadn't posted, tweeted, or spoken publicly. Every journalist tried. Every camera lingered outside her office. But inside, her staff moved with quiet intensity, eyes locked to screens, printers, whirring folders, closing just as fast as they opened. They weren't done. They were preparing. And in the stillness of that silence, the media began to shift. It wasn't just about partisanship anymore. It was about control, about who got to ask the questions, about who was brave enough to say, "This doesn't add up." One network summed it best, flashing a new segment title just before a commercial break, "From fashion icon to possible witness, where is Melania Trump?" For the first time in her public life, Melania was no longer being photographed, she was being investigated. For 6 days, the country waited for her to speak, but Melania Trump said nothing. No tweets, no press release, no cleverly worded post from her stylist's account. Not even a whisper from the East Wing. The silence wasn't just absence, it was presence. Heavy, deliberate, impossible to ignore. It became a wall, a strategy, and for some, a confession. Her next public appearance was already scheduled, a long-standing commitment to visit the pediatric oncology wing of a Manhattan hospital. The White House considered canceling, but to cancel would suggest she had something to run from. So they didn't. The morning air was crisp, too crisp for spring, and the cameras lined the hospital's curved entrance, like vultures waiting for movement. When the black SUV pulled up, time seemed to hold its breath. The door opened, and there she was. Silver heels, cream-colored coat, hair set into place, though not as smooth as usual. Her makeup was immaculate, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Not the kind that comes from lack of sleep, the kind that comes from watching your world loosen inch by inch from the bolts that once held it in place. She waved briefly and walked inside. For 45 minutes, she visited room after room, smiling gently at children kneeling beside their beds asking their names. To the press cameras trailing her, it might have looked no different than any other First Lady visit. But to the hospital staff, something felt off. Her hands trembled slightly when she accepted a handmade drawing from a girl named Maya. She dropped her clutch once, a tiny moment, quickly smoothed over, but the nurse nearby noticed the flash of frustration in her eyes. In the final room, a toddler reached up and touched her cheek. Melania didn't flinch. She closed her eyes just for a second and let her palm rest over the child's fingers. The nurse said it was the only moment that seemed real. But it was what happened backstage that would haunt those who saw it. There was a long mirror in the private green room set aside for her security detail and wardrobe adjustments. The kind of mirror that didn't flatter, didn't lie. Melania stood alone in front of it, unaware that one staffer frozen in the hallway could see her through the slightly open door. She wasn't adjusting her dress. She wasn't fixing her hair. She was staring at herself. Not vainly, but like someone trying to recognize the woman staring back. Her shoulders tensed as if bracing for something. Her chin lowered. She exhaled slowly. And for a moment, just a blink, her expression broke. The high cheekbones, the practiced elegance, the soft poise. All of it flickered. What replaced it was something almost childlike: fear, confusion, maybe even guilt. Then the door creaked and she turned sharply. Composure snapped back in place like a mask made of porcelain. She left through the side exit, escorted by Secret Service, speaking no words. By that evening, the clip of her visit aired across every major network. Analysts dissected every gesture, every look, every hesitation. The freeze frame of her looking in the mirror, captured accidentally by a hospital security camera, was leaked online by morning. It was shared millions of times under the caption, "When the First Lady saw herself." No one could say what she was thinking, but everyone felt it. And the silence she carried began to speak louder than any speech ever could. The backlash came like a storm, not unexpected, but fiercer than anyone had predicted. Within hours of Melania's trembling hands making the evening news, conservative pundits began to circle their wagons. Cable shows lit up with headlines like AOC's cruelty on display and turning grief into politics. On a slick graphic aired on a primetime panel, Fox News labeled her the Congresswoman who weaponized a woman's pain. Clips from the Liberty Gala were replayed, slowed down, dissected, distorted. Her voice, calm and measured on the night of the revelation, was overlaid with ominous music. One commentator leaned forward, eyes sharp behind his glasses, and said, "Melania Trump may be a former First Lady, but she's also a wife, a mother, a woman who has been through more scrutiny than most of us could bear. And now she's being paraded through the court of public shame by a woman who claims to fight for justice. But where is the justice in humiliation?" Hashtags like "Liras shame on OC" began to trend. Protesters appeared outside her New York district office holding signs that read, "Let women heal" and "Compassion over cruelty." Even some centrist voices hesitated. The tone shifted. What had been a revelation of truth began to be reframed as an attack not on corruption, but on vulnerability. Her staff went into defense mode. They pulled late nights, drafting press releases, clarifying timelines, resharing footage that emphasized the facts, the file, the name, the midnight meetings. But for every clip they posted, a new one emerged with her face frozen in what now seemed like aggression. The court of public opinion had splintered. Truth was no longer the point. Optics were. And yet through it all, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez remained silent. For 5 days she said nothing. No tweets, no interviews, no response to the panels. Her allies urged her to speak, clarify your intent. One House colleague advised, say you feel for her, just soften the message. But she refused, because she knew softening it now would mean she never meant it to begin with. Then came the Oversight Committee hearing. It was a standard session originally scheduled to discuss veterans' healthcare procurement. But when she entered the chamber, the reporters knew something else was coming. They leaned forward in their seats, hands on recorders, cameras blinking red. Midway through the discussion, she requested the floor. Her tone was calm, her posture unshaken. Her words, however, landed like thunder. There are people who say I crossed a line, that I turned pain into politics, that I should have let the silence speak for itself. But I'll say this, and let it be clear, silence is the most dangerous thing in power's playbook. Silence lets secrets rot behind flags. Silence lets women disappear beneath titles. Silence is why Colonel Renner's name was almost forgotten. And if telling the truth makes people uncomfortable, maybe it's time we all get uncomfortable. The room held its breath. Even the opposition for a flicker of a second went still. That clip, 37 seconds, became the most shared congressional soundbite in months. Some still called her ruthless. Others began to reconsider. Lines were drawn not just politically, but emotionally. Supporters doubled down. Detractors grew louder. But one thing was certain. The country was no longer watching passively. It was choosing sides. It began as a blurry screenshot, a text thread between two supposed White House staffers, timestamped just days before the Liberty Gala. The messages were short, cryptic, and cruel. She's going to drop the name. Tonight. Tell Melania to prep her tear show. AOC wants blood. Let's give her the stage. Within minutes, the image spread across X, Reddit, and fringe media sites. Influencers reposted it with fire emojis. Conservative radio shows dissected every typo, every ellipsis, as if decoding some grand scheme. Headlines followed fast. AOC orchestrated emotional trap, and inside the plot to humiliate Melania. For Melania's team now, on edge, frayed by the constant spotlight, this was the moment to strike. Her new spokesperson, a sharp-tongued crisis handler, flown in from Florida, took to the press room and delivered the line that sparked a media war. This is no longer about secrets or scandals. It's about cruelty. It's about a woman in power who will burn another woman just to climb higher. That clip ran on every network except the progressive ones. It was clear now the gloves were off. But inside AOC's office, no one was panicking. They had seen the screenshot, ran it through metadata checks, identified the inconsistencies in fonts, the unnatural spacing between timestamps. Within hours, a cybersecurity analyst on staff confirmed what they had already suspected: it was fake, sloppy, manufactured in Photoshop by an anonymous account with no verified history. Still, the damage was being done. The fake thread was now news. Kyrens ran with words like alleged, unverified, and reportedly. But in a divided media landscape, qualifiers didn't matter. A narrative was forming not about truth, but about tactics. When approached by a reporter in the Capitol hallway, AOC didn't flinch. "Let me be very clear," she said, her voice steady, her eyes fixed. "We don't smear. We show receipts. We do the work, and we let the facts speak louder than whispers in the dark." She didn't elaborate, didn't name names. But within an hour, her team posted a single minimalist graphic across social platforms, a side-by-side comparison of the fake thread and the official communication logs subpoenaed from White House staff devices. Beneath it, just two words: verified, transparent. The tide didn't turn instantly, but something shifted. Moderate journalists began questioning the origins of the smear. Tech blogs did deep dives. A Pulitzer-winning reporter from ProPublica publicly demanded accountability for those spreading disinformation. The smear was losing traction not because it was disproved, but because it had been dissected too thoroughly to stay alive. In AOC, she returned to the work. Quietly, relentlessly. She knew the game now wasn't to shout louder. It was to hold the line while others unraveled. The ballroom was a golden ocean of chandeliers and soft violins, the kind of elegance only television could amplify. The annual Unity for Children Cancer fundraiser had always been Melania's safest stage, a night of gowns and charity where politics stayed outside the velvet ropes. Tonight she wore pale silver hair, swept to one side, every step calibrated to exude grace. As she approached the podium, a standing ovation rippled across the room. Cameras panned gently to celebrities, donors, diplomats. Applause swelled. The teleprompter cued her smile. Tonight we celebrate courage, the kind found in the smallest hearts facing the greatest battles. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, as she looked down at the front row children in small suits, parents clinging to hope. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the podium. For a brief moment there was peace. Then came the vibration. Two aides in the wings, nearly hidden behind gold drapes, turned toward their earpieces. Another staffer leaned in, whispered something urgent short. Within seconds, a fourth aide approached the stage stairs with a phone in hand. His face was drained of all color. He mouthed it, the files just dropped. All of it. Somewhere backstage, a laptop screen flickered as the drive loaded high-resolution photos. Visitor logs, travel schedules, a handwritten note, security footage timestamps from Fort El Paso's restricted wing, all encrypted, now decrypted, and now public. A sudden flicker passed through Melania's expression, barely perceptible but real. Her eyes darted left, then right. For half a breath, her composure cracked. We are reminded, she continued the pause, too long now, to ignore of the strength it takes. To fight. She swallowed hard, her next word catching in her throat. One hand reached for the side of the podium, the other reflexively touched her earpiece, only to remember she wasn't wearing one tonight. The room remained politely silent, but cameras were zooming in. Her thumb trembled. A deep breath. Another pause. The mic wobbled in her hand. And then she did something unexpected. She stepped back. Not far, just one small quiet step. Enough for every trained eye to know something had gone wrong. She turned briefly as if checking the side of the stage, then faced the crowd again with a forced smile. It didn't land. Behind the curtain, a digital storm had erupted. Major outlets had already picked up the drop. Push notifications pinged across devices nationwide. On CNN, breaking White House visitor records contradict official timeline in Renner case. On MSNBC, exclusive images show late-night access granted to Colonel James Renner. Even Fox cut to a developing story banner, unsure whether to attack or defend. Back in the ballroom, the host and actor known for his Oscars charm walked gently toward the podium, placing a hand on Melania's shoulder as he whispered, "We can wrap here if you want." Melania nodded once. Small, controlled. She left the mic behind, walking down the stairs slowly. Applause trickling in again this time, confused, scattered, unsure whether to clap for strength or sympathize with collapse. No statement was issued that night, but the nation had already watched the moment frame by frame. A poised first lady, a frozen sentence, a tremble, a falter, and one golden step back that said everything her press team never could. The fall had begun not with a headline, but with silence under lights. By sunrise, America had already watched it in slow motion again and again. 3 different camera angles from 3 different news outlets captured the precise moment Melania stepped back from the microphone at the cancer fundraiser. Her falter, her silence, the faint trembling in her fingers as her hand reached for something invisible. The entire ballroom frozen in uncomfortable empathy, now replayed in the palm of every phone in the country. CNN cut it with soft piano music, calling it the moment the mask cracked. Fox blurred the tremble, framing her exit as grace under pressure. But it wasn't the cable news cycles that detonated the culture. It was TikTok, a 15-second edit stitched together the charity stage, the frozen mic in her hand, then a sudden dissolve into that now infamous image from Fort El Paso Melania, in a soft blue coat standing inches from Colonel Renner, her gloved hand touching his. The kind of touch that didn't need a caption, just undeniable. The background blurred their expressions unguarded. Her smile wasn't political, it was personal. That clip hit 10 million views before noon. By lunchtime, Reddit had turned into a war zone. One post titled, "She didn't say a word, but we heard everything," reached the front page in minutes. Thousands of comments followed, most focused not on scandal, but emotion. That wasn't guilt. That was heartbreak. It's not even about cheating. It's about being caged. A woman who blinked at the wrong second and the world saw her life fall apart. The audio remixes came next. Some used cinematic music behind the moment. Others matched her stillness with narration from Maya Angelou, Nina Simone, even AOC herself. One viral post paired the clip with AOC's line from an earlier hearing, "Silence is the most dangerous thing in Power's playbook." It hit differently now. The algorithms couldn't keep up. Instagram Reels, YouTube compilations, hashtag storms, sure, Melania stepped back. Just sure, the moment she fell. Sure, Renner was real. Even satire accounts joined in, some cruel, others piercing. One tweet simply read, "When your prison is designer and the bars are invisible." It garnered 400K retweets. In an unexpected twist, young women on TikTok began posting stitched reactions. Not laughing, not judging. Just sitting in silence watching her freeze on stage, whispering, "I know that look. I've worn that look." They weren't defending the affair. They weren't denying the implications. They were bearing witness to something deeper, a woman once untouchable who had cracked under weight not meant for one heart alone. Meanwhile, AOC remained silent. She hadn't posted since the files dropped. Her team didn't respond to requests for comment. But her digital fingerprints were everywhere, clips of her debates, her speech on power and silence, her first campaign ad, where she stared down the Capitol dome. The world now drew lines between her voice and Melania's tremor, between confrontation and collapse. In classrooms, morning TV, even church sermons, the narrative twisted again. This wasn't just political anymore. It had become cultural, emotional, archetypal. One woman spoke truth. One woman couldn't speak at all. And every woman watching had to choose who she was. By nightfall, The Atlantic published a headline that framed the moment not as scandal, but as symptom, the undoing of elegance. When a woman's poise becomes her cage. America wasn't watching a fall from grace. They were watching what happens when grace is all a woman's ever allowed to show. By the next morning, the country's mood had shifted, no longer just curious or scandalized, but viscerally stirred. It began outside VA hospitals. Small gatherings of veteran spouses, many still wearing pins or faded army jackets, showed up holding signs with phrases inked in quiet fury. "He served. She hid. Tell the truth." Accountability isn't an attack. It's a necessity, not just Melania. Why did he disappear? Local news crews captured tearful interviews. One woman whose husband had served 2 tours overseas and never came home the same trembled as she spoke into the microphone. "We've buried too many men for politics to erase one more. If Renner was used, forgotten, or punished for something human, then we deserve to know." Another protester held up a photo of her son beside a headline about Colonel Renner's disappearance. She wasn't angry at Melania. She was angry at silence. These men don't vanish. Somebody makes them vanish. At college campuses, things looked different, but echoed the same urgency. Student groups organized candlelight vigils, not in condemnation of Melania, but in memory of those who'd served alongside Renner. One flyer read, "When names disappear from the record, so does justice." Social media amplified every image. A group of retired military nurses marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in coordinated white coats, their signs hand-stitched instead of printed, "Truth has no rank." In the middle of it all, AOC said nothing. Not publicly, not on Twitter, not to CNN. She walked into Congress the day after the leak with no comment and dark sunglasses. But her silence wasn't absence. It was strategy. Behind closed doors, her staff leaked precisely what they needed to. Not full files, not redacted documents, just enough. Visitor logs, internal memos. A calendar discrepancy here. A night vision still framed there. Nothing inflammatory, nothing false. Just small shards of truth sharp enough to draw blood. One particularly viral leak involved a calendar notation from the First Lady's East Wing. On 3 separate occasions, Renner's initials were penciled in next to the word discreet. No explanation followed, but the timing aligned perfectly with the unscheduled midnight visits. That detail, while subtle, sent reporters into a frenzy. Cable news anchors speculated, columnists argued, but everyday Americans, especially military families, felt something deeper. It wasn't about adultery. It wasn't even about shame. It was about erasure. Melania, once a woman behind glass, had become the center of a national reckoning, not for loving someone she shouldn't, but for what had allegedly happened to him afterward. The human cost hidden in the folds of classified schedules and diplomatic silence. And so the country asked, where is Colonel Renner? Why did he vanish? What did Melania know who ordered it? The answers weren't clear, but the questions had taken root. In Kansas, an elementary school teacher taped a sign to her window that read, "My students learn honesty every morning. So should Washington." In San Diego, a billboard paid for by anonymous donors read, "The truth doesn't smear. It clarifies." The national temperature was rising, but not in rage, in resolve. And while AOC maintained her outward silence, her eyes in brief hallway shots seemed to say more than words ever could steady, knowing unafraid. The pressure hadn't peaked, but it had built, enough to rattle marble walls, enough to make the First Lady's silence no longer poetic but political. And in the silence between these two women, America had begun to find its voice. It began as a rumor, just a whisper among military journalists and veteran networks that someone had finally tracked down Colonel Thomas Renner. No press conference, no public stage, just a 37-minute interview posted quietly to a lesser-known independent news channel based out of Austin. The backdrop was modest, a rented studio with bad lighting, and a camera that shook slightly every time the interviewer shifted in his chair. But none of that mattered, because the man on screen was real, hollow-eyed, gaunt, paler than the uniformed, proud image once projected across military briefings and state dinners, but unmistakably him. The journalist, a soft-spoken former Marine named Rafi Elston, kept the questions tight, the tone respectful. He didn't ask for salacious details. He asked for the truth. Renner didn't flinch. "I was stationed at Fort El Paso for 12 months. During that time, I was asked to handle operations that in hindsight had nothing to do with standard protocol. Special visits, midnight briefings, no paperwork, no logs." He didn't name Melania, but he didn't need to. The timeline aligned too cleanly, the references too deliberate. I was told to delete logs, told not to question who came and went, told that what happened in that wing was above me. I didn't sign up for that. Rafi leaned in. "Did you comply?" Renner exhaled. "At first, yes. You do what you're ordered to do." But then something didn't sit right. The visits got longer. The secrecy got tighter. And one night I was told to sign a statement that I hadn't seen anyone at all. He paused. His voice lowered. "I never said her name, but they wanted to make sure no one else could either." When asked why he disappeared, Renner didn't speak for a moment. He looked directly at the camera as if weighing every syllable. Then he answered, not with drama, but with a tired clarity. "They said I was burned, that I was becoming a liability, so they gave me a choice: early discharge, sealed under medical discretion, or fight it and risk court-martial under conduct unbecoming. I took the discharge. I disappeared because I was erased." The journalist pressed gently, "Why speak now?" Renner blinked. "Because if I don't, I'm just another ghost in their system. And because someone brave decided to speak first." That line lit up the internet, a clear, if unspoken, nod to AOC. Renner never raised his voice. He didn't cry. He didn't beg for vindication. He simply offered pieces of a puzzle that the public had already begun assembling. He didn't accuse Melania directly. But when he described a high-profile visitor with classified access, whose presence was off books, there was little doubt about who he meant. She wasn't cruel, but she was protected. And protection, when misused, becomes power. Within hours of the interview's release, major news networks scrambled to verify the footage. Military officials issued bland denials. The White House offered no comment, but America had already seen it. Clips of Renner's interview flooded TikTok, Twitter, even late-night monologues. One moment in particular went viral. "I served my country. I didn't serve a shadow." In living rooms across the nation, veterans sat in silence. Some nodded, some wept. Some picked up the phone and called fellow soldiers they hadn't spoken to in years. Renner hadn't named names, but he didn't have to. He'd spoken plainly, and in a system built on secrecy that alone was revolutionary. No cameras were allowed inside. That had been her one condition. No reporters, no flashing lights. Just a quiet, unannounced visit to a children's cancer clinic tucked in the suburbs of Tempe, Arizona, a place too small to make national news but big enough to still carry meaning. Melania arrived alone, dressed plainly in soft gray slacks and a long-sleeved blouse that didn't scream First Lady. It whispered someone trying to blend, her only company a single Secret Service agent who waited by the doors and pretended not to hear the whispers following her down the hallway. She moved slowly, deliberately, pausing at each room to smile, touch a shoulder, kneel by a child, drawing in silence. The nurses stood off to the side, unsure if they should greet her or pretend she was just another visitor, in the swirl of IV carts and crayon boxes. Then came the moment. A nurse in her early 30s, freckles, tired eyes, and a name tag that read, S. Calhoun, stood at the end of the corridor. She wasn't supposed to speak. She did anyway. Her voice was gentle but unflinching. Why now? The question hung in the sterile air like the echo of a dropped tray. Melania paused mid-step. For a second, she didn't seem to hear. Then she turned. Slowly, her eyes met the nurse's, not guarded, not rehearsed, just tired. She stepped closer, close enough that no microphones could have caught it even if they tried. Her answer came low, almost a whisper, because disappearing doesn't fix anything. The nurse blinked. She wasn't expecting honesty. Not from her. Melania didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. That one sentence, small, vulnerable, heavy, was more than she had said publicly in weeks. And that's how the story got out. Not through a press release, not through a formal statement, but from that nurse who posted later that night on a private Facebook group for pediatric caregivers. She came today. Quiet, soft. But when I asked her what we've all been thinking, she looked right at me and said, because disappearing doesn't fix anything. I don't know what that means to the press, but to me it meant she was human. Within hours, the quote had gone viral. It was reposted by celebrities turned into minimalist graphics, stitched into TikTok videos with piano soundtracks. And for the first time in weeks, the name Melania trended not alongside words like scandal affair or cover-up, but with something more complex: reckoning, reflection, maybe redemption. The White House still offered no statement, but behind closed doors, her staff scrambled to recalibrate. They had expected silence or denial. Not this, a quiet pivot, a ghost of responsibility that no spin doctor could fully control. Even AOC took notice. In a rare moment of pause, she watched the circulating clip of the nurse, recounting the moment, her brow furrowed. Because disappearing doesn't fix anything, Melania had said. AOC didn't smile, but she nodded just once. Because whether it was strategy, sincerity, or some strange mix of both, one thing was clear: Melania Trump had spoken. Not in a press room, not in front of a podium, but in the softest place imaginable, a hallway filled with sick children where truth couldn't be dodged by optics or spin. And sometimes that's exactly where change begins. It didn't happen overnight. But it happened. At first, the conversation was scandal. Then it was shame. But now, just 2 weeks after the cancer fundraiser, where Melania faltered, and days after her quiet visit to the children's clinic in Tempe, the American public had started asking a different question. Not what happened, but how did no one know? Suddenly, the whispers weren't just about loyalty or infidelity. They were about power, about what secrets were kept behind locked doors, what decisions were made in private rooms at midnight, and who had access to the levers of government influence without accountability. It wasn't just Melania they were scrutinizing anymore. It was the architecture around her, the shield of unchecked privilege, the culture of invisibility. Why was a military officer meeting with her off record? Why were visitor logs edited retroactively? Who signed off on the erasures? Cable news began to reflect the shift. CNN aired a special segment titled, "The Curtain, Not the Woman." Even conservative commentators, once gleefully attacking AOC for weaponizing pain, started to hedge. This isn't about the First Lady's choices, one Fox panelist offered. It's about the people who let those choices stay hidden. For AOC, the silence had become heavy. Her inbox was flooded. Her district staff could barely manage the calls. Some furious, some grateful, most confused. But one email stood out, a single sentence from a veteran's wife in Kansas. "Please keep fighting, not for headlines, for sunlight." So when the community center in the Bronx filled to standing room only for her scheduled town hall, AOC stepped onto the stage with no teleprompter, no notes, and no spin. She took a breath and began. I didn't come here to defend myself, she said, because this was never about me. The room was quiet. This has always been about what we let happen in the dark, about the deals we pretend aren't made, about the rules that shift when power walks into the room. A murmur of agreement rippled across the crowd. I've heard it all, that I'm attacking a woman, that I'm tearing down tradition, that I'm reckless. But let me be clear, this isn't about gossip. This is about governance, about transparency, about accountability. She let the words settle. And I know it's easier to look away, to stay neutral, but we don't rise by protecting shadows. We rise by standing in the light. The crowd stood, not all at once, but in waves. A woman near the back wiped her eyes. A young man held up his phone live streaming the moment. And across the country, clips of AOC's speech were clipped, edited, and replayed on every platform. Some still hated her. That wouldn't change. But others, veterans' families, ethics watchdogs, former staffers who had kept quiet for too long, began to speak out. New files surfaced. A former scheduler leaked call records. And quietly, members of the Oversight Committee requested an internal review. The narrative had shifted, not by force, not by scandal, but by something far harder to manufacture: moral clarity. And the woman who once stood alone at a podium now had a movement behind her. The storm didn't end with a headline. It settled into something deeper: policy. 3 weeks after AOC's town hall speech went viral, Capitol Hill, once hesitant, even dismissive, had no choice but to respond. Public sentiment wasn't just simmering, it was boiling. And with midterms looming, neither party wanted to be seen shielding shadow games. The first domino to fall was the Whistleblower Protection Expansion Act. Drafted in a rush but refined with bipartisan input, it passed 312 to 121 in the House and 62 to 38 in the Senate. For the first time, protections were extended not just to federal employees, but to private contractors and embedded military personnel who flagged ethical concerns within civilian political interactions. The legislation had a name, but what gave it power was a face: Colonel Renner. He never testified, but his off-the-record interview with an independent journalist, where he described being asked to delete logs that should never have been hidden, had become a rallying cry. His refusal to name names didn't matter. Everyone knew, and that silence, measured, dignified, carried weight. It was the kind of moral restraint Americans weren't used to seeing in scandal. The Pentagon couldn't ignore the heat. Days after the act passed, the Department of Defense released a statement announcing the launch of an unprecedented internal audit, a full-scale review of all unscheduled, undocumented meetings between senior military personnel and civilian officials over the last 10 years. The name of the initiative: Clear Lines. It was more than symbolic. For years, critics had argued that the proximity between the military and the executive branch had blurred, that formal chains of command were being bypassed by informal relationships, dinners, retreats, private briefings, even midnight visits to residences, all off-book, all deniable. Now, for the first time, those blurred lines were being traced. At first, the audit stayed quiet. Names were redacted, timelines vague. But as pressure mounted, summaries were released to the public, carefully curated, but revealing enough to change the conversation. One summary in particular lit a firestorm. It documented a pattern: 3 high-level officials meeting regularly with a member of the first family without advance notice or Secret Service authorization. The implication wasn't criminal, it was constitutional. Who was influencing national security policy? And why was it hidden? Cable networks hosted roundtables. Editorials flooded the presses. But it wasn't just pundits talking. It was teachers asking students to write essays on the difference between power and influence. It was veterans groups posting statements about the chain of command being sacred. It was young voters sharing TikToks with captions like, "Privacy isn't a privilege when you hold public power." And through it all, Melania stayed silent. She had returned to her work: quiet visits to children's centers, brief appearances at non-political events. But the woman who once commanded fashion headlines now moved like someone aware of how far ripples could reach. Even AOC, in a rare podcast interview, admitted, this was never about punishment. It was about pressure so that silence wouldn't win again. The ripple effects were no longer metaphor. They were structural, legislative, cultural. It was a country slowly reckoning with what it allowed to happen in the margins. And those margins were finally being rewritten. It wasn't on any official schedule. No podiums, no statement to the press. Just a small meeting room on the third floor of the Capitol, its windows sealed, its lights low, its door watched by two aides who knew better than to ask questions. At 3:41 p.m., Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked in first. Her stride was measured, a folder in her hand. At 3:46, Melania Trump entered wearing no heels, no makeup, just a navy blue coat that swallowed her frame. The door shut behind her and the hallway went still. For nearly an hour, no sound emerged. No cameras, no staffers inside, no recording devices. Just two women, one at the height of political fire, the other standing in the shadow of a scandal that had become too large to control, facing each other across the quiet. What was said in that room has never been disclosed, but what followed told its own story. At 5:02 p.m., Melania's official account posted a single sentence on her personal letterhead, centered, no caption, no further comment. Truth doesn't ask for comfort, it asks for courage. The words traveled fast, picked up by every news outlet within minutes, translated into 26 languages by the next morning, printed on posters in downtown D.C., and shared in whispered conversations on military bases, where wives and widows had been watching too long from the sidelines. AOC didn't issue a statement. She didn't need to. Her team, when pressed by reporters, simply responded. The Congresswoman believed a direct conversation free from performance was necessary. That's all we'll say. But the ripple was unmistakable. Insiders noted a shift in Melania's tone almost immediately. She canceled a fashion event in Paris, declined 3 offers for exclusive interviews. Instead, she began working quietly with a bipartisan group focused on ethical reforms around military family boundaries, choosing not to lead it, but to sit in the back during early meetings, listening more than speaking. AOC, meanwhile, channeled the moment into action. She reintroduced a transparency bill long stalled in committee, this time attaching a clause inspired by Melania's quote. The clause was simple but radical, requiring an annual ethics audit of all civilian political interactions, with embedded military personnel, reviewed by a third-party council with no executive ties. One reporter from The Atlantic, piecing together fragments from aides who had heard murmurs through closed doors, described the meeting as less a confrontation and more a reckoning. Not a debate of facts, but of feelings, of responsibility, of womanhood, of what it meant to be seen as a symbol and still carry private pain. Photos leaked days later, unofficial, blurry, from the parking garage below the Capitol. One showed Melania, hand on the door of her car, her face unreadable. The other showed AOC standing still beside a column, eyes closed as if holding something fragile between her breasts. Neither woman looked victorious. Neither woman looked broken. They looked instead like something had passed between them, something unspoken, something not meant for spectacle. And in a city where silence often hides shame, this silence felt different. It felt sacred. The auditorium lights flickered once, then steadied. Folding chairs creaked as parents shifted, and a low hum buzzed through the room, the kind of quiet tension that always settled before a high school debate final. At center stage stood a 16-year-old girl with box braids pulled into a loose bun, glasses slipping slightly down her nose. A tremble in her hands she tried to hide by gripping the edge of the podium. Her voice wasn't loud when she began, but it was clear. My name is Kamira James, representing Roosevelt High. My topic today, accountability and leadership. Her opening statements were sharp, data citations, headlines. But it was her closing minute that silenced the room. She paused, looked down at her note cards, then let them fall to the side, looked out at the crowd, and said, if we don't hold the powerful accountable, what example do we set? The room didn't erupt into applause. It didn't need to. A quiet rose instead, something heavier, more respectful. Teachers glanced at each other. Parents blinked harder than usual. One judge set down her pen, folded her arms, and simply nodded. That line hadn't come from a textbook. It came from a hearing 6 weeks earlier. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had said it on record, eyes-level voice, unwavering, in a room full of men who had once laughed at her behind closed doors. The video of her speech had been viewed 30 million times by now, but somehow hearing the words on a stage in a school gymnasium felt more profound, more permanent. Elsewhere, life went on. The scandal had dimmed, but not disappeared. Renner had been reassigned to administrative leave. 2 ethics investigations were pending, one still sealed. The Pentagon released a quiet policy reform buried in page 118 of a 300-page memo. All civilian military meetings must now be logged and archived. No fanfare, no press conference. But it was there. Melania hadn't spoken publicly since the closed-door meeting with AOC. She had declined Oprah, declined 60 Minutes, even declined a commemorative interview request from Vogue. But she did post one last time. A grainy photo, a hospital corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing above, a child's hand, small, frail, gripping hers. No faces shown, just the caption. Disappearing doesn't fix anything. 7 words, simple, direct. A mirror of her earlier quote in Tempe. But now they read differently. Less defensive, more reflective. In the weeks that followed, the photo became a symbol. It was pinned to community boards, printed on signs during silent walks, and even screen printed onto T-shirts worn by young activists who hadn't cared about politics until this moment showed them why it mattered. The nation hadn't healed. There were still arguments over whether the affair was even real, over whether AOC had crossed a line, or whether Melania had ever meant to step into one. But something had shifted. People were listening, not just to politicians, but to one another. In the classroom, in churches, in living rooms where daughters asked mothers, "Would you have stayed quiet?" and mothers no longer dodged the question. And in that gymnasium, as Kamira stepped down from the stage, her best friend whispered, "You sounded like her." Who Kamira smiled. "You know, her, no name needed, no explanation, just the echo of a sentence that now belonged to more than one voice." The lights dimmed, the chairs scraped back, the judges stood, and somewhere in the stillness before the next debate began, the final words settled across the room, not from a headline, not from a tweet, but from a girl with a voice steady enough to remind the country, we are still here, and we are still watching. Of all the stories we tell about power, perhaps the most moving are those that begin, not with strength, but with silence. This story reminds us that truth isn't always shouted, it's often whispered, resisted, or painfully revealed. Melania's quiet reckoning, AOC's principled stance, and a student's courage on a school stage each reveal something essential. Leadership isn't about perfection. It's about showing up when it's hardest. In an age where image often outweighs substance, this narrative dared to slow down and ask, what do we owe each other when the cameras are off? It's not just a political tale. It's a mirror held up to us all. Question for you. When was the last time you saw someone choose integrity over comfort, and how did it change the way you see courage? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.